Well, welcome to this webinar that's a side meeting of the special session of the United Nations General Assembly against corruption. Our theme is combating corruption, the relevance and capacities of faith-based organizations. Thank you for joining this program. Our panelists will represent both UN agencies and experience in the United Nations system, as well as diverse faith traditions, with experience in combating, proposing solutions to corruption, trafficking, public corruption, organized crime. And we will discuss particularly the role, the relevance, capacities of FBOs, faith-based organizations, and their work to prevent corruption, to intervene in efforts to improve ethics, justice, rule of law, good governance, and sustainable development. I'm Thomas Walsh. I'm chairman of the Universal Peace Federation and co-chair with Michael Plotzer of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. I'd like to invite co-chair Michael Plotzer, who will moderate the question and answer session after the panelists speak. Michael?
Well, I am so happy that we are here. We are now, this is the 14th webinar that we have organized in the last 2 years. I think it's a success. It's a great success that we have a super panel and that we are continuing in these efforts to involve faith-based organizations in promoting the work of the United Nations. So I think it's a good alliance, and we are happy that it's working so well.
Well, thank you, Michael. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Jay Albanese. I don't know if Jay is able to just say hello, but he's a member of the steering committee of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. Jay, if you just want to say a greeting.
Yes, very, very pleased to be here and to reemphasize the importance of civil society, focusing today specifically on faith-based organizations. I believe as the other segments of society, government and business do their thing, it's time to raise the voice even louder for civil society. And hopefully today is one step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Albanese. And hope to hear from you as well as Michael as we move toward the end. I now turn to our distinguished group of panelists. It's my privilege to introduce our first speaker, none other than Ambassador Thomas Stelzer. The bios are listed in the chat column. You are invited to put your questions in the chat column. You can address them to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. Dr. Ambassador Thomas Stelzer is Dean of the International Anti-Corruption Center based in Vienna. Ambassador Stelzer.
Thank you very much. Greetings from New York. I'm participating from the UN headquarters. Those of you who know the headquarters, you can easily define that I'm sitting in the Indonesian lounge here, just outside the General Assembly Hall, where the plenary debate is still going on after the adoption of the policy document, which was negotiated in preparation for the special session of the United Nations General Assembly Against Corruption, UNGASS 2021. This UNGASS 2021 is the highlight, the climax of a development which has been unfolding for 20 years. Thinking back, it was in 2001 when I chaired my first crime prevention commission in Vienna, and that session adopted a document, a resolution confirming that corruption was a structural impediment to sustainable development. That was in 2001, before the negotiations for the United Nations Convention Against Corruption have even started, exactly 20 years ago. So the first phase was dominated by the negotiation of the convention, which was then open for signature, as you remember, in 2003 in Merida, and which now needs to be implemented. And at about 2007, we were looking in Vienna. I was still permanent representative at that time at the United Nations in Vienna, at the very slow implementation status of UNCAC, and we were kind of frustrated, thought, what can we do to facilitate quicker implementation of the convention? And UNCAC was and is a very valuable instrument, not only because it's the only universal instrument against corruption that exists, with 186 members, but it is a legal instrument which provides us with a legal framework to, if implemented, fight corruption on the basis of the rule of law, excluding immunity. Now, you know that very often in the United Nations context, after negotiations are concluded, member states lose the energy or don't have enough energy left to implement what they have negotiated. So to prevent UNCAC from becoming dead wood, but to become a very relevant instrument implemented, we thought, how can we facilitate its implementation? And this is where IACA, the International Anti-Corruption Academy, Don Walsh called us center, which is not wrong. Our name is Academy, but of course we are a center in the fight against corruption, was established in Luxembourg, close to Vienna. And the next stage of the process was the introduction of anti-corruption, the fight against corruption, into the Sustainable Development Goals. As Target 5 in Goal 16, which is the SDG that deals with good governance, with establishing structures which provide the framework for the implementation of all the other SDGs, the 16 SDGs. So that's somehow the framework. And fighting against corruption is the cross-cutting element in the SDGs. It becomes clearer and clearer that considering the enormous amounts of money that are siphoned away from productive economies by corruption, by bribery, by all these illicit monetary flows, amounts that cannot be compensated for, neither by official development assistance, nor by direct investments, nor by remittances. That to raise the money, to help member states raise the tax revenues, to make additional funds available for the implementation of the SDGs is only thinkable if we have some success in the fight against corruption. So fight against corruption, success in the fight against corruption, a precondition for raising the money for implementation of SDGs, the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development, for keeping the world livable. And I think here we meet with the faith-based organizations. The member states of the United Nations decided to review the processes in a special session of the General Assembly, UNGASS, which is happening right now. I'm sure you're all very curious what has been happening here. You know, I listened very carefully to many of the statements of the last 2 days, and I can report to you that there is a consensus that corruption needs to be fought. This is very reassuring. There was not one voice casting any doubt. Every speaker was reaffirming that we cannot afford any longer the negative costs, the externalities that corruption causes to our economies, and that fighting corruption, implementing UNCAC is in our shared interest. That's a big step forward. Now, of course, you know that there is a big step from declarations to implementation. And I think this is exactly where the non-governmental organizations come in. To hold those who make the decisions, who establish the frameworks to fight corruption, be it criminal networks or societal networks that need to be resilient enough to allow for fighting corruption efficiently, to hold the decision makers accountable. This is the biggest challenge. And decision makers normally think in 4-year cycles. They think about how to maximize votes. They have a rather time-limited approach. And here, this is where NGOs come in with the long-term perspectives and their responsibility to hold decision makers accountable to what they have promised, to make sure that the politicians do, after having been elected, what they promised before, and if not, hold them accountable at the next elections or in any other way. So there needs to be a global coalition to implement UNCAC and to fight corruption in all its aspects sustainably. So what we have been doing at IAC in Vienna, we are technical assistance provider in the field of education, to help those who are supposed to implement the rather complex legal provisions of the convention in real life, need technical assistance first to understand the provisions and then helping them build the capacity to really implement the convention. This is what we have been doing. We have been reaching out. We have been offering to practitioners, to lawyers, prosecutors, academicians, judicial personnel, civil servants, helping them to gain the capacity to implement the convention in their daily work. We have been offering 2 academic programs, 2 master's programs, one a little bit more academic, the other one more practically, more compliance-oriented, that have produced 3,000 alumni in 161 countries in the last 10 years. This is how long we have been working. Not me, myself, I just joined the Academy last year, but the Academy as such has been there for 10 years. And the 3,000 alumni who have become bridgeheads and for the Academy in their countries, forming networks, multiplying what they have learned, supported by our alumni network, of course, extremely valuable, but the numbers are not enough. So our big challenge now is, how can we increase our diffusion capacity dramatically and not only reach 3,000 alumni, but reach every future diplomat, every future manager of the international system, but every future manager of the global economy, to help them first see where corruption happens, then second, understand why fighting corruption is our shared interest, and then third, provide them with the technical assistance to fight corruption efficiently.
Mr. Ambassador.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to need to, this is a fascinating and perfect opening statement, but I do need to move on. If you just wrap up in the next 30 seconds and then we'll move on. But I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay. When you give an ambassador a microphone, you have to control him. Also, I've been looking at my watch. We're trying to stay within the 7 minutes. But I think that's what it is. You cannot really conclude a statement like this because this is a process which is developing. And we hope that UNGASS, which is happening now, will be a next step, opening the next phase towards the next COPS meeting, the meeting of the UNCAC member states next December in Egypt, where we can compensate for some of the shortcomings of the political outcome document and where we can verticalize the fight against corruption in the context of the global system, supporting the role of the UNODC and bringing together all the efforts, preventing to reinvent the wheel, becoming more targeted, more client-oriented, working more on demand, and strengthening the impact of our fight against corruption. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this opening statement, which is much appreciated. I will move straight away to our next panelist. Very happy to have with us Ms. Livia Krings. She is with the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. She is a Crime Prevention Criminal Justice Officer in the Corruption and Economic Crime Branch of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, otherwise known as UNODC, based in Vienna. Livia Krings, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Dear colleagues and friends, greetings from Vienna. It is a privilege to be here with you today at this side event, in particular at this moment in time when the first ever special session of the General Assembly is taking place in New York. And we are at one day after the adoption of the political declaration by the special session. The special session and the adoption of the declaration are a true milestone, and the declaration will most certainly serve as an essential roadmap for the efforts to prevent and combat corruption globally in the years to come. As you may know, this special session is a culmination of a long and arduous preparatory process undertaken by the Conference of the States Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. This is a process that started in December 2018 with the adoption by the General Assembly of the first resolution on the special session. This was followed by another General Assembly resolution adopted in June 2020, and we at UNODC provided the technical support and substantive expertise to this process. The declaration defines several areas of action for member states, as well as for the international community at large. This includes many commitments in the areas of prevention, criminalization and enforcement, international cooperation, asset recovery, technical assistance, information exchange, and also advancing the implementation of the 2030 agenda. The declaration also contains a section on advancing a forward-looking anti-corruption agenda and framework, which, among other ideas, commits the member states to ensuring the corruption safeguards and responses are integral parts of the recovery efforts in the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It also contains a commitment to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all its forms by 2030. And there is a call to all states, parties, UN entities, but also NGOs, the private sector and the general public to strengthen their support for the convention, the conference, and UNODC. I would also like to highlight that in the political declaration, member states noted with appreciation the important role of civil society, academia, and the private sector, and the media in identifying, detecting, and reporting on cases of corruption. The member states also committed to taking appropriate measures in order to promote the active participation of individuals and groups outside of the public sector, such as civil society, NGOs, community-based organizations, and the private sector in the prevention of and the fight against corruption. Dear colleagues, please allow me now to give some background on UNODC and some of the work that we do. As many of you may know, UNODC is the guardian to the UN Convention Against Corruption in the sense that we, meaning in particular the Corruption and Economic Crime Branch that I represent, serve as the Secretariat to the Conference of the States Parties to the Convention. In this connection, let me mention that the Convention contains a provision, Article 13, on participation of society. The article is This article is quite clear in that states parties to the convention shall take appropriate measures to promote the active participation of individuals and groups outside the public sector, such as civil society, non-governmental organizations, and community-based organizations in the prevention and fight against corruption. The article also contains a list of measures to be taken by states parties in order to strengthen the participation of society in anti-corruption work. This would probably be the right moment to mention that UNODC also serves as the Secretariat to the implementation review mechanism established under the Convention. This unique peer review mechanism provides for the review of the implementation of the Convention by a state party by other states parties. And the Article 13 that I mentioned just now on the participation of society is one of the articles whose implementation is being reviewed in this current second cycle of the mechanism. I would also add here that according to the terms of reference for the mechanism, states parties shall endeavor to prepare the responses to the self-assessment checklists through broad consultations at the national level with all relevant stakeholders, including the private sector, individuals and groups outside the public sector. In this connection, I can inform you also that almost 97% of state parties under review have also involved other stakeholders in the country visits conducted as part of their reviews under the mechanism. I would also like to say a few words about the participation of non-governmental organizations in the work of the conference. The convention recognizes the key role of the civil society in preventing and fighting corruption. And the rules of procedure for the conference provides for the participation of civil society in the work of the conference, in particular in its plenary sessions. There is also an annual civil society briefing that takes place on the margins of the sessions of the Implementation Review Group, which is one of the subsidiary bodies of the conference. I happen to be the civil society focal point in the secretariat to the conference, so I would be happy to provide more information on this, but in the meantime, I would like to encourage all the organizations present at this event and that are admitted to participate in the work of the conference to continue to actively contribute to the deliberations of the conference through statements, either at the biennial sessions of the conference or at the NGO briefings. I would also encourage you to continue organizing side events, as they hold a lot of interest for the conference participants. I should also highlight that, as I'm sure you know, our colleagues in UNODC civil society team have been working very closely with the coalition of faith-based organizations, and I understand that this community has made significant contributions to our work. I would like to conclude by saying that there is an overarching values-based moral dimension to the work that we do, including on anti-corruption. And these values and this moral dimension are rooted not just in the philosophy, but also in the different faiths and religions that have emerged over centuries and which continue to underpin our vision of the world and the work that we do today, including in preventing and combating corruption. This makes your anti-corruption work and your perspective of crucial importance. And I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Ms. Krings, for an excellent intervention and following very well on Ambassador Stelzer's statement that gives us a great foundation to now turn to a series of three representatives of the faith-based organization perspective and or civil society perspective. So to move straight into that in the interest of time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Levi Bautista, President of the Conference of Non-Governmental Organizations, or Congo, in consultative relationship with the United Nations. Dr. Bautista, welcome.
Walsh, thank you indeed for having me again in this webinar. You have invited me in one of this series of wonderful seminars that you have conducted. And thank you for assembling a panel such as this to discuss something of very urgent and relevant matter that must be attended to and must concern faith-based organizations. Today, I speak to this team more in my role as main representative of the United Methodist Church at the United Nations. But even that, I should also say that as president of Congo, the Conference of NGOs in Consultative Relationship with the United Nations, the organization is very much involved in the work, especially of UNODC. I see in the participants a number of members of NGO committees of Congo, courtesy of our good relationship with Mirella Dumar-Frahi of the Civil Society Office of UNODC in Vienna. The United Methodist Church has a long history of faith engagement in the public square. The photo next to the UN headquarters depict the Church Center for the United Nations, which is a United Methodist property. And the other building right next to the US Capitol is the United Methodist Building, where our witness and advocacy as a religious body are given tangible expressions in local and international arena. I'm especially grateful to the organizers for assembling an interfaith panel to speak to the very issue that is the burden of this meeting. Religious NGOs today are serious interlocutors for religious, ethical, and spiritual understandings, informing and influencing the development of international law and ethics. The active participation of civil society, notably religious NGOs at the UN, allows for mutual advancement of the charter mandates of the UN, including a recognizable place at the UN for religious, spiritual, moral, and ethical perspectives. Combating corruption in all its forms is part of that central tenet of all religions that are about the prospering of values and norms that make for the flourishing of all human beings and the planet they all share. What we call the United Methodist Social Principles in my church testify to Methodists' long history of concern for social justice in a manner that is prayerful and thoughtful, and an effort to speak to the human issues that we confront in the contemporary world. Early Methodists expressed their opposition to the slave trade, to smuggling, and to the cruel treatment of prisoners. Today, our social principles address squarely the matter of graft and corruption. United Methodist social teachings emphasize that the system of justice God desires for us focuses on healing and restoration. It heals the wounds of the victims, addresses the wrongs of the perpetrator, restores society to wholeness, and stops, not perpetuates, cycles of systemic evil. At the core of criminal justice reform, especially in combating corruption, must be the concern to address the harm that our actions have done on the human person, to their dignity, and to their relations in community. That's about the violations of human rights, and moving to righting the relations that have been broken by the harm. The restoration of relations is what many sacred religious texts refer to the fullness of life. Graft and corruption frustrates and subverts that fullness of life. Here is what we say as United Methodists on graft and corruption, something that echoes very well the UN Convention Against Corruption. I quote, "God's good creation, the fullness of its bounty, and the loving, nurturing relationships that bind all together are intended by God to be enjoyed in freedom and responsible stewardship. To revere God's creation is a sacred trust that enables us to fashion just, equitable, sustainable relationships in communities. The strength, stability, security, and progress of such relationships and communities depend on the integrity of their social, economic, political, and cultural processes, institutions, and stakeholders." It continues, graft, referring to unfair or illegal means of acquiring money, gain, or advantage, especially by abusing one's position in politics, business, and social institutions, including religious institutions, transgresses human dignity and violates human rights. Corruption, referring to dishonest and undue exploitation of power for personal gain, subverts God's intention for the fullness of life and creation. We therefore say that graft and corruption tangle the social thread of communities. They erode the moral fiber of human relationships and sully the reputation of social institutions. Legislative and judicial mechanisms, and I may say the UN Convention is one of those, including a strong, just criminal justice system, must deal with graft and corruption at every level of society. Good, just political governance, characterized by transparency, accountability, and integrity, is crucial to the eradication of graft and corruption. Societies that are graft-ridden and plagued with corruption are needful of God's pardoning love and redeeming grace. That's the official position of the United Methodist Church. It echoes what the concern of the June 1, 2020 General Assembly Resolution 74/276 that corruption threatens the stability and security of societies, and that corruption undermines democratic institutions, they slow economic development, and contributes to governmental instability. With the reach and outreach of religious bodies, there is much that religious and faith-based institutions can do in supporting the convention. Indeed, there is much reason for faith-based bodies to engage in anti-corruption activities, because anti-corruption work is about restorative justice. It is a combating of extractivism, which corruption is. It entails even more focused protection of human dignity and prevention of human rights violations that deter graft and corruption. So, combating corruption is a way to restore right relations, and here the intersection of anti-corruption with the positive campaigns for the fulfillment of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as Ambassador Stelzer already emphasized, especially SDG 16, are very important, so that the human fabric and the planetary fabric, the achievement of peace and prosperity, are achieved and not undermined by the graft and corrupt activities of people and societies. I think, Dr. Walsh, I'll end it there and would welcome exchange with the audience when we're done. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bautista. As always, you are very well organized and concise, and you bring your presentation with the good graphics and clear articulation. And I learned a lot, emphasizing the fullness of life and the restoring of right relations and extractivism. The corruption is a form of extractivism. So thank you very much indeed. We'll now move happily to Imam Sheikh Muhammad Ismail. He is, of course, the Muslim chaplain at the University of Sheffield, in the Sheffield, the UK. I'm happy to say as well, and thankful, that he is a distinguished member of the steering committee of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. So, Imam Sheikh Muhammad Ismail, we want to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Chair and Co-Chair, and Right Honorable Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. First of all, I greet you with the greeting of peace, and I hope and pray that this session will benefit those people who are in tyranny and pain because of corruption. I begin in the name of Almighty God, the most merciful, the most gracious, and I send salutations on all the prophets of Almighty God who were sent as guides for mankind. As you all know, that almost all faiths and religions are based on moral and ethical principles to help the followers to protect themselves from all forms of corruption in the society. Similarly, Islam as a religion has very clear and strict rules in the Holy Quran and also in the teaching of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The rules clearly condemn any such practices which lead to any form of corruption in the communities. In many verses, which are actually numbered 47, there is warning of anger from Almighty God against corruption. And the traditions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, clearly indicate that such people who are involved in the corruption are not among the community, or is not regarded as to be in the community. The World Economic Forum 2021 report says that corruption costs developing countries $1.26 trillion every year. Yet half of Europe, Middle East, and Asian countries think that it is acceptable. And there are several lists of global indexing of almost all the countries of the world in line with the perceived numbers in corruption. And they start from 1 to 180. And the indexing authorities are the United States of America, World Economic Forum, Transparency International, and those that are texting in the audience, they can join Transparency International, which is working against corruption, World Bank, and many more. But these actually lists are based on the perception. So corruption is perhaps best described as a smelling force which perpetrates poverty, so insecurity, and robs the world's actually most vulnerable people of desperately needed public services. It can manifest in many forms, from criminal acts like bribery, extortion, embezzlement, to highly questionable, but sometimes legal practices like nepotism, patronage, and cronyism. Most corruption takes place in the shadows, away from the praying eyes of public scrutiny. And this sometimes makes it precise impact difficult to quantify, but pick any country in the world that is representative democracy, a one-party state, or a military dictatorship, and you will find a common thread. They are all grappling with problems that stem from the corruption. I quoted this from the Transparency International recent report on corruption matters. Corruption is a widespread global problem that has far-reaching negative consequences on all aspects of life. Muslim majority countries are most often ranked as highly corrupt by the Transparency Organization. Yet, the religious aspects is not mentioned as a factor in most reports. Almost all studies about corruption are undertaken from the perspective of developed countries. In Islam, the concept of bribery is very wide. It includes anything that is offered in order to obtain the invalidation of what is correct or an endorsement of a wrong action. Not only is this unlawful, it is a major grave sin. And there are so many verses in the Holy Quran, as I said, 47 I gathered here, but if I start quoting them, you will take, a very long time. When bribery becomes an acceptable factor in societies, it leads to a loss of rights and prevalence of injustice and corruption. That is why, the Prophet condemns such action. And also, there are other examples from the traditions of the Prophet which are very clearly, indicating to making a duty that people must stop corruption. And there is a concept and agreement that the largest proportion of the world population are following some kind of faith or religion. Religion provides the foundation of ethics mostly, and religious also economically poor countries where religions are practiced compared to economically developed countries where religious are less in practice. And we see that there are evidence that religious practices are not in any way linked to corruption. However, according to statistics, financial corruption is much higher in the poor countries compared to the rich countries. One of the worst forms of corruption is stealing public money in highest amount and banking it abroad in the rich countries. In most cases, the stolen public money is either from foreign development aid for poor people, from loans taken from rich countries, or commission from sales of arms or forms of contracts of development projects. The main causes for such corruption are greed of money, desire of becoming rich quickly, achieving higher political and financial position, and it causes as a result of weak democracy, poor governance, lack of people, civic or civil participation, lack of trust in the system, and lack of transparency, and powerful, unelected bureaucracy and weak administrative structure with no press freedom or additional factors for corruption to grow. Another reason for corruption is strict control of economic freedom. The corruption hurts everybody in the society, and particularly poor people. And corruption erodes the trust in the public sector to act in the best interest of general public. It also wastes taxes and government collected revenues, which put effect on the important community development projects, which means public have to put up with poor quality services or infrastructure, or miss out altogether on health, basic life amenities, corruption, and also corruption increase income inequality and poverty through lower economic growth and bias the tax system favoring the rich people. Faith and religious organization can play a vital role and in combating corruption in all societies. In poor countries, faith-based organizations can openly condemn corruption and challenge corrupt regimes. They can raise awareness among the general public and work with international organizations such as UN, Transparency International to work against corruption in their respective region and countries. In the Western countries, faith-based organizations can demand the rich countries to take action against corrupt politicians, officials, or rulers who steal wealth from their poor countries and deposit them in the rich Western countries who are equally regarded as partners in this corruption, in my view. Therefore, faith organization, ladies and gentlemen, faith organization and the UN must work closely to get poor countries out of this tyranny of corruption. Thank you very much. I hope I have not exceeded my time.
Thank you very much indeed, Imam Mohammed Ismail. An excellent presentation, and thank you for representing Islam and so effectively, and pointing out how corruption hurts everyone, erodes trust, and the important role that faith-based organizations can play in combating corruption. Our last speaker, none other than Bishop Munib Yunan, former president, Lutheran World Federation, Honorary President, Religions for Peace, will speak to us by video message. He has a 7-minute video that has been prepared, and we will now show, and straight away after, we will have about 15 minutes for question and answer.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I greet you from Jerusalem that asks for your prayers for peace and justice. Thank you for inviting me to address a very relevant topic, combating corruption. This is a very important theme as we together search for a world of justice in all sectors of life. My biblical tradition is rich in combating all kinds of corruption. Some may ask, why does our world and the UN expose the issue of corruption today? It existed at all times, even in history. Isn't the social media making the corruption more appealing? I do not think so. In a globalized way, in a globalized world, we are more interdependent than ever. We are more interdependently accountable to each other. Our relations should be built on such a morality that respects the integrity of oneself and the dignity of the other. For this reason, faith-based organizations are to closely work to find the common values from our various traditions and work for transparency and accountability, as well as combating any kind of corruption, be it bribery, lobbying, extortionism, cronyism, nepotism, parochialism, patronage, influence peddling, fraud, sexual harassment, graft, or embezzlement. Corruption and its impunity erode the trust in the public sector to act in their best interests. Corruption leads to weak governance, which in turn fuels organized groups or promotes crimes such as human trafficking, arms and migrant smuggling, counterfeiting, and trade in underground societies. Corruption weakens economic development and perpetuates poverty levels and social inequalities. Corruption obstructs equality and justice in our world. And as faith-based organization, we ought to be the voice of the conscience in our world. Where there is corruption, we should dare to address it and not find excuses. We should dare to speak the truth, even in these type of time, even if that person belongs to us. I have served 7 years the Lutheran World Federation, and we have worked for transparency and accountability all the time and continue to work in our Lutheran World Federation. And it is based on our faith. As people of faith, rooted in the gospel, we uphold the principle that each human being has received his or her dignity as a gift of God and therefore needs to be respected and protected. This fundamental insight, rooted in our faith, needs to be expressed coherently in the ways we meet and interact in events that brings us together. I would like to say how we did it in 3 ways. 1, there is a clear policy of transparency on all levels, from top to down, from down to top. LWF keeps revising its policies. It always conducts risk assessment. It continues to train its staff. LWF monitors strict procedures in its works. And I can clearly say it is a very transparent and accountable faith-based organization. Secondly, LWF staff has a code of conduct regarding sexual exploitation of abuse of power, fraud, and corruption. And every employee, every officer, every person has to sign this code of conduct. Basic ethical commitments and standards are to be lived out in the work of LWF. They include respect for the dignity and integrity of all human beings, fair and just treatment of all without discrimination, exploitation, or harassment, responsible stewardship in the exercise of power and use of financial and other resources, respect of diversity, inclusiveness and participation and transparency and accountability, and being also, being also sensitive to the context. Thirdly, before the start of any LWF event, two members to form the Complaint Handling Committee, CHC, are identified, preferably one woman and one man. The CHS members will receive a short briefing from the event organized, and they clarify the code of conduct and procedures to follow. At the beginning of the meeting events, in its first session, the organizer reminds all participants about the code of conduct. The focal persons are introduced. Focal persons draw the attention of all participants to the code of conduct and the commitment of LWF to uphold them. Should anyone need to make a complaint, either they approach a member of the CHC or fill out a complaint form and send it by email to the complaint address given. All complaints are dealt with carefully and promptly, and measures are taken. Measures are taken according to the incidents. When we speak on combating corruption, I strongly believe that civil society, faith-based organization, and small businesses should have clear policies, as LWF does. Transparency and accountability starts at home. We should be transparent and accountable, not for the others, for ourselves, because then our conscience will be clear. If we grow up an honest and a society of integrity, then as faith-based organization, we have achieved our goal of being more just and equal societies, where every citizen, every human being has equal opportunity and knows that whatever is done is accountable. May God bless us in combating corruption, because we want a world of justice. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Munib Yunan from Jerusalem. It's now after 1 a.m. In the morning, so we are grateful to have your video message. I'm now going to turn it over after these excellent presentations from our panelists to Michael Plotzer to offer some questions. I think we'll go into gallery mode and of the panelists, plus also Jay Albanese, if he's able to still be with us, who will make a few closing comments. So Dr. Plotzer, if you'd moderate the discussion, and if we could move into gallery view for the panelists.
I hope I'm heard, and we have 6 questions at the moment. They're not all addressed to individuals, but raise a little bit of, I don't know, reality, let's call it, about the whole problem. One is the circle that has been described roughly of how the poor countries who have a low report are transferring money to the rich countries' banks, and these are kept very happily in the UK, Canada, USA, Austria. So this cycle of money that moves back to the rich countries, perhaps we should focus more on them. And these are comments from two countries. We have also someone from Africa talking. We don't seem to have talked much about the whistleblowers, the heroes who risk their lives often and go and identify the issues and often end up in jail themselves. So I wonder if there are people who would like to deal with these questions. Otherwise, we will, there are some other questions, but let me go through this round, please. Does anyone have a response to these issues?
Dr. Platzer, one of the questions was actually mentions me, and if I could respond, this is the question from Nkwedi Roland Tisha of Cameroon. I'm not sure whether my response will be satisfactory. It's simply to say that Mr. Tisha's concern about the punishment of whistleblowers is indeed repugnant, and I think as much as possible that parliaments and congresses of national governments enacting laws for the protection of whistleblowers, so that there is a juridical forum, if you will, for the verification of any allegations of bribery, corruption, or any other acts inimical to what I called earlier, to the fullness of life, to the sanctity of the human person and their capacity to use time, talent, and treasure in a way that is good stewardship rather than extracted unduly from them by people in power, people that have access to the structures of governance. That's why the concern against corruption is very much the concern, not just for good governance, but for just relations. So just to end this, when the person who asked the question said, what can be done? The matter of legislation to protect whistleblowers is one thing. It's another for societies, nation states, if you will, to provide for economic security, to combat poverty. And that's the connection to SDGs, combating poverty so that the fertile ground for graft and corruption is erased. And rather, the fertile ground should be about plenty and plenitude, so that no one must bribe to be able to get food on the table or something like that.
Okay, Tom, may I have two more questions, please. One just came in. It's about, should we not look at the religious institutions themselves, where they are committing crimes and taking money from organized criminal groups? We've heard about that about the banks in Rome. And the other is a more generic question. I think Livia also mentioned that this whole thing is based on morality. And shouldn't we look at ourselves that how do we get rid of the self-centeredness of the human being who has an interest to get rich, to become important, to have his family be taken care of? How do we deal with self-centeredness of the basic drive of corruption? So I have those two questions. Anyone want to take them? Is Thomas Stelzer still with us?
Ambassador Stelzer had another appointment at just 30 minutes ago. He had to exit.
Livia, can you answer these questions?
On the matter of, thank you. On the matter of self-centeredness, I'm not sure if it can be eradicated, because I think self-centeredness is an inherent part of human nature. And so the only way to alleviate it in us is through moral or spiritual development. It's more of a philosophical and religious question, but of course it does have implications for the work as well.
Thank you. Okay.
Maybe I can just add a brief word, put on a moral philosopher hat or moral theologian. You know, there's also the theory that self-centeredness or self-interest at some point expands beyond just hedonism for the self into recognizing, as others have said, that the corruption actually undermines our own self-interests. So in some respects, we should get rid of corruption for selfish reasons sometimes. So back to you, Michael.
Okay, no, I think the other question was answered really by Mr. Bautista. Mr. Bautista, about how religious organizations have to be careful themselves about corruption and discrimination.
Dr. Platzer, I would not even say they should also. In fact, in the history of religious institutions, their entanglement and complicity in corruption and other forms of subversion of the integrity of creation and of the fullness of life is tangible. We know that it is a burden of all religious institutions that once their institutions are incorporated and are part of the social institutions, religious institutions can no longer hide under their sacred texts, because then their sacred texts are equally muddied by practices of corruption. And I think there is no, religious institutions are warned not to exempt themselves from such acts, because history bears out the complicity of religious institutions and of religious leaders. And so the enactment of agreements, of normative agreements, as in international law, like the UN Convention, exempts no one. And I think that's the way to go, rather than providing a blanket of protection for religions in the way I don't think corruption exempts religion in the examination of church-state and religion-state relations, where one cannot interfere in the activities of the other. Corruption certainly is not one of those that governmental institutions cannot look into if religious institutions are engaging in those activities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of the questions and the time. So
Well, maybe then, if I can just suggest, maybe Imam Muhammad to say a closing word. Then I'd like to ask Jay Albanese to just offer a few thoughts or reflections on what he's observed and any final comments. Sheikh Muhammad.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm first of all, I would like to thank the organization, the United Peace Forum, for and the Coalition of Faith-Based Organization for taking the responsibility of taking care of those people who are most affected by the corruption around the world, and particularly in the third world countries. And I will say that for religious organization from any faith, it is very important that they follow strict ethics guidelines and also, take the corruption out of. It is very difficult. I agree with you that it is very difficult to completely eradicate the corruption, but there are countries in the world, they are working very hard to address the corruption. And what I said, that on the Transparency International website, if there is a database of the broadsheet database, which is actually clearly indicating that, and people can go and have a look and see and can join very easily the organization and report and read their reports. What is important here, that one is the financial corruption, which is very much the bureaucracies and the dictatorships and all those non-democratic countries where people are stealing money of poor people and bringing it to the West, and the West is not actually, it's not doing enough to stop that. And I think it's very important for the United Nations, as they are addressing at the moment the terrorism and other, financial supports, they must address corruption as well, or briberies or corruption or whatever. The other thing is that clearly some countries would know that the arms sales and what is called the commissions and so on and so forth that need addressing. But what is important here is another form of corruption, for example, genocide, discrimination against minorities in countries, and intentional ethnic cleansing, and so many other, and sexual harassment, gender inequalities, and abuse of women. All these things comes under corruption, and I think they need to be addressed. So I think if we work together as faith organization, faith-based coalition, and the United Peace Force, I think there is a lot to do, and with the United Nations. But United Nations need to be sharpen its agenda to remind its members their responsibility in this regard, because this corruption is terribly affecting the third world countries. And there are no health amenities, there are no sanitation, the basic human facilities are not there for millions and millions of people, and it is not fair. And if we don't care, then these people have to find other solutions, which will be an irony and a disaster. Thank you very much for, once again, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Tom or Dr. Thomas Welsh, for organizing this event, and to the United Nations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam Sheikh Mohammed. Dr. J. Albanese, you have the final word.
The final word is a question which I've just dropped into the chat, and it's a question for reflection, I think, for all of us. And to me, the takeaway question is, how can faith-based organizations make a larger difference in the global concern about corruption and justice in the lives of their constituents, in your home countries, and globally? This is an issue of organization, of strategy, of thoughtfulness, and I think there's a lot of motivated, intelligent people who I think can be mobilized to make a larger difference than is being made under the current circumstances. So I encourage this to be the beginning of a discussion rather than the end of one. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank all of the panelists. We will post this webinar on the website of all the co-organizers, particularly the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations, and we will send all the panelists the link, so you will have your own copy of the recording. It's been a splendid panel, and very grateful for each one of you and your interventions and bringing insight and wisdom to the discussion, including Bishop Munib Yunan, who delivered a wonderful address by video. We're sorry we could not get to all the questions in the chat due to the limitations of time. We're grateful to our audience. And Michael, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I do want to apologize to the questions that came in after we closed. It's a very interesting, and I think Livia can answer some of those questions. And it's obviously, the discussion has just started, as Jay says, and I'm glad we had such a powerful panel. And I hope we can also get this in some sort of written form. I think this was really a high quality discussion.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And we'll work on that. Okay, we are out of time. Thank you. Let's stay in touch. Let's work together. We have many good suggestions. Even the questions have stimulated us. And although we couldn't give them their due entirely during this webinar, the conversation has just begun. I think that's our concluding reason, and we have a lot of work to do. So thank you all. God bless you. And for those of you continuing with the UNGASS program, hope that it all goes well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. It was great to have you with us, indeed. And Dr. Bautista, Imam Muhammad Ismail, and Thomas Stelzer. Michael, please give him our best. He really started us off very well. And I thought the bishop kind of brought at least the panelist interventions to a dramatic close that was quite appropriate.
Yeah, my favorite.
And I think, not to pat myself on the back but we had a good balance of the experience of the UN personnel and representing the UN side with the faith-based side, and people that could navigate or bridge, which sometimes is a gap between the two spheres that may not easily communicate with one another. But the more we can learn one another's language, then we find more common ground. And it's through exchanges like this that we move in that direction. So once again, thank you all.